How many secrets can a stretch of beach hold? How many lives can disappear without a trace before someone finally connects the dots? And what happens when the hunter realizes he's been staring at his prey for over a decade? The salt air of Gilgo Beach carried more than the scent of seaweed that October morning. It carried the weight of 13 years of unanswered questions, 13 years of families wondering, 13 years of a killer walking free. Commander Tom Mitchell stood at the edge of the crime scene, his weathered hands gripping a steaming cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The forensic team worked methodically around the latest discovery, their white suits moving like ghosts against the gray morning sky. This wasn't supposed to be his case anymore. At 58, Mitchell had earned the right to handle white-collar investigations, pension fraud, maybe some political corruption. But when Detective Sarah Chen had called him at 4:47 a.m. with the words, "Another body at Gilgo," he knew his past had finally caught up with him. The beach held too many secrets, and Tom Mitchell held the key to all of them. The first body had been discovered in December 2010. Shannon Gilbert, 24 years old, had vanished after a frantic 911 call that lasted 23 minutes. Search teams combing the marshy terrain for her remains instead found 4 other bodies, all wrapped in burlap, all positioned with surgical precision along Ocean Parkway. The killer had been methodical, calculated, and completely invisible. Mitchell had been a detective then, younger, hungrier, driven by the kind of righteous anger that made good cops great. He'd spent countless hours walking that beach, studying the positioning of the bodies, analyzing the killer's pattern. The victims were all sex workers, all advertised their services online, all had disappeared without a trace before ending up in that desolate stretch of sand. The media called him the Long Island serial killer. Mitchell called him patient. But patience was a double-edged sword. While the killer waited, watched, and planned his next move, the investigation had stalled. Leads went cold, witnesses disappeared, and the case file grew thicker with dead ends. Mitchell had requested reassignment in 2018, not because he'd given up, but because he'd realized something that kept him awake at night. The killer was still hunting. Now, standing over the 13th victim, Mitchell felt the familiar burn of obsession reigniting in his chest. The body had been discovered by a jogger at dawn, wrapped in the same burlap, positioned with the same terrifying precision. But this time something was different. This time the killer had made a mistake. "Commander," Detective Chen approached, her notebook already filled with preliminary observations. "Victim appears to be female, mid-20s, similar positioning to the others. But there's something you need to see." Mitchell followed her to a section of beach cordoned off with yellow tape. Half buried in the sand, almost missed by the initial sweep, was a piece of fabric. Not burlap. Cotton. Expensive cotton with a distinctive weave that Mitchell recognized immediately. "Get that to the lab," he ordered, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. "Full analysis. DNA, fibers, manufacturing origin, everything." As the forensic team carefully extracted the fabric, Mitchell's mind raced back through 13 years of investigation. The killer had been flawless before, leaving no trace evidence, no DNA, no witnesses. This wasn't carelessness. This was evolution. The killer was changing his pattern, becoming bolder, and that boldness would be his downfall. The drive back to headquarters took Mitchell through Massapequa Park, a quiet suburban community where families barbecued on weekends and children rode their bikes without fear. It was the kind of place where a monster could hide in plain sight, where neighbors waved to each other every morning without suspecting the darkness that lived next door. Mitchell's phone buzzed with a text from the lab. Preliminary results on fabric. Rare cotton blend, high-end tailoring. Checking manufacturers now. He pulled into the parking garage beneath Suffolk County Police Headquarters, his mind already formulating the next phase of the investigation. The killer had been patient for 13 years, but patience required discipline, and discipline could crack under pressure. It was time to apply some pressure. The incident room was exactly as he'd left it in 2018. Photos of the victims lined one wall, their faces staring down at anyone who entered. Maps of Gilgo Beach covered another wall, marked with red pins indicating body locations, search areas, and potential dump sites. In the center of it all was a timeline, 13 years of death marked in careful chronological order. Detective Chin found him there an hour later, staring at the wall of faces. "Lab results," she said, holding up a folder. "The fabric is from a shirt, custom made by a boutique tailor in Manhattan. Only 12 shirts with that specific weave were ever produced." Mitchell turned, his eyes sharp with renewed focus. "Do we have a customer list?" "Better. We have receipts, measurements, and delivery addresses." Chin spread the documents across the conference table. 5 of the customers are deceased, 2 live out of state, 3 are women. That leaves 2. Who are they? Chin consulted her notes. James Morrison, 62, retired accountant from Deer Park. No criminal record, married 40 years, volunteers at his church. She flipped the page. And Robert Crane, 44, architect from Massapequa Park. Divorced, lives alone, works mostly residential projects in Suffolk County. Mitchell studied the addresses, the occupations, the personal details. On paper, both men looked unremarkable, the kind of neighbors who borrowed lawnmowers and attended block parties. But killers didn't announce themselves with scarlet letters. They hid behind normalcy, behind the mundane details of suburban life. "We'll start with Morrison," Mitchell decided. "If he's clean, we move on to Crane. But we do this quietly. No uniforms, no warrants until we have probable cause." The Morrison interview was a dead end. The retired accountant wept when shown photos of the victims, his wife hovering nearby with tissues and horrified gasps. His shirt had been ruined in a gardening accident months ago, thrown away with the weekly trash pickup. His alibi for the key dates was solid. Family gatherings, doctor's appointments, church events, all documented and verifiable. Which left Robert Crane. The architect lived in a modest 2-story house on a tree-lined street where the lawns were perfectly manicured and the driveways were swept clean. Mitchell parked across the street and studied the property through binoculars. Normal house, normal yard, normal life. But normal was often a mask, and Mitchell had learned to look beneath masks. They approached the front door at 3:15 p.m. on a Tuesday, when most of the neighbors would be at work and the street would be quiet. Mitchell rang the doorbell and waited, his hand instinctively checking the position of his service weapon. Robert Crane answered the door in khakis and a polo shirt, his brown hair slightly disheveled as if he'd been working. He was average height, average build, with the kind of forgettable face that wouldn't stand out in a crowd. Perfect camouflage for a predator. "Mr. Crane? I'm Commander Mitchell, Suffolk County Police. This is Detective Chin. We'd like to ask you a few questions about some missing persons cases." Crane's expression didn't change, but Mitchell caught something in his eyes, a flicker of calculation before the mask of concerned citizens slipped into place. "Of course, officers. Please come in." The interior of the house was immaculate. Furniture arranged with geometric precision, Books organized by height, not a speck of dust anywhere. But it was the basement door that caught Mitchell's attention. Heavy wood, multiple locks, and fresh scratches around the handle as if it had been opened recently. "Can I offer you coffee? Water?" Crane asked, his voice steady, controlled. "We're fine, thank you." Mitchell settled into a chair that gave him a clear view of both Crane and the basement door. "We're investigating the disappearances of several women over the past few years. All of them advertised escort services online." Crane nodded gravely. "Terrible business. I saw it on the news. Any leads?" "We're following up on some evidence found at the most recent crime scene." Chin showed him a photo of the fabric. "Do you recognize this?" For just a moment, Crane's composure cracked. His eyes widened slightly, his breathing quickened, and his hand moved instinctively toward his collar. Then the mask returned, but Mitchell had seen enough. "I'm sorry, it looks like fabric. Should I recognize it?" "It's from a custom shirt. A shirt that was made specifically for you by Madison Brothers in Manhattan." Mitchell leaned forward, his voice taking on the tone that had broken 1,000 suspects over his career. "A shirt that was found buried next to the body of a 26-year-old woman named Jessica Martinez." The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Crane sat perfectly still, his hands folded in his lap, his face expressionless. But Mitchell could see the calculations happening behind his eyes, the careful consideration of options, the weighing of risks and benefits. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Crane finally said. "I lost that shirt months ago. Dropped it at the dry cleaners and they claimed they never received it." Mitchell stood up slowly, his hand moving casually toward his weapon. "Mr. Crane, I'm going to ask you to place your hands where I can see them." That's when everything changed. Crane moved with shocking speed, lunging not toward the door or the window but toward the basement. Mitchell was fast for his age, but Crane had youth and desperation on his side. He reached the basement door and slammed it behind him, the sound of multiple locks engaging echoing through the house. "Chin, call for backup," Mitchell shouted, drawing his weapon. "And get a battering ram." The basement door was solid oak, reinforced with steel plates that hadn't been visible from the outside. This wasn't a standard residential installation. This was a barrier designed to keep people out. Or in. It took the tactical team 40 minutes to arrive, 40 minutes during which Mitchell could hear movement below, the sound of machinery, and something else that made his blood run cold: muffled screaming. When they finally breached the door, the scene that greeted them would haunt Mitchell for the rest of his career. The basement had been converted into a workshop, complete with industrial equipment, refrigeration units, and tools that belonged in a morgue, not a suburban home. They found Robert Crane at the far end of the basement, standing over a stainless steel table where a young woman lay unconscious but breathing. In his hand was a surgical saw, its blade catching the harsh fluorescent light. "Step away from the table," Mitchell ordered, his weapon trained on Crane's center mass. Crane looked up, and for the first time Mitchell saw him without his mask. The eyes were cold, calculating, completely devoid of human empathy. This wasn't a man who killed in passion or rage. This was a predator who hunted because he enjoyed it. 13 years, Crane said quietly. 13 years and you finally figured it out. Step away from the table, Robert. Instead, Crane raised the saw. Do you know what it feels like to be truly invisible? To walk among people every day and know that they can't see what you really are. The tactical team had positioned themselves around the basement, but the woman on the table was too close to Crane. Any sudden movement, any miscalculation, and she would die. "I see you now," Mitchell said, keeping his voice calm, professional. "And you're going to step away from that table and surrender your weapon." Crane smiled, and in that smile, Mitchell saw 13 years of victims, 13 years of families destroyed, 13 years of a monster hiding in plain sight. "You know what the beautiful thing about being invisible is?" Crane asked. "You can become anyone you want. Respected architect by day, god of life and death by night." He raised the saw higher, preparing to bring it down. Mitchell didn't hesitate. The shot was clean, precise, centered exactly where his training had taught him to aim. Robert Crane collapsed beside the table, the saw clattering harmlessly to the concrete floor. The young woman was alive, barely conscious but breathing. As the paramedics worked on her, Mitchell walked through the rest of the basement, cataloging the evidence that would close 13 years of investigation. Photographs, trophies, detailed journals describing each victim's final moments. But it was what he found in the refrigeration unit that confirmed what he'd suspected all along. Body parts, carefully labeled and dated, going back over a decade. Robert Crane hadn't just killed his victims. He'd kept pieces of them, souvenirs to help him relive the experience. The media called it the end of the Long Island serial killer case. Families finally had answers, closure, justice. But Mitchell knew better. Evil didn't announce itself with fanfare. It hid behind suburban normalcy, behind pleasant facades and friendly neighbors. As he stood on Gilgo Beach one final time, watching the sunset paint the water crimson, Mitchell thought about the 13 women who would never see another sunset. They'd found justice, but justice couldn't bring them back. The salt air carried the scent of seaweed and memories, of cases closed and lives destroyed, of monsters who looked like ordinary men until someone finally saw them for what they truly were. Commander Tom Mitchell walked away from the beach, leaving behind 13 years of nightmares and taking with him the satisfaction of knowing that Robert Crane would never hurt anyone again. Some cases end with trials and convictions. Others end with a single well-placed shot and the sound of a saw hitting concrete. In the war against monsters, Mitchell knew which kind of ending he preferred. The beach held its secrets no more.